Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our first webinar of 2021, What We Learned from the 2020 Election Exit Polls. We're going to get started, and I will now hand it over to Edison Research Senior VP, Tom Webster.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you everyone for attending this today. I know that today is a day where there's much to learn about short selling stocks and GameStop and everything else that's happening in the markets. But if you're here with us today, you're here to learn a little bit about what we learned in the 2020 general election. For those who don't know, Edison Research has been the sole provider of exit polling data to the National Election Pool since 2003. So if you watched any television news, for example, this past election night and heard them talk about the exit polling that was done by us. On those networks, you would also hear them report about the vote count as it was coming in. That is also provided by Edison. So we've had certainly a hand in observing elections, really, even from before 2003, but certainly as the official provider of those things for all of those many years. And we've had a staff that has been behind the scenes for all of those elections throughout the course of our history with the National Election Pool. And they thought they had seen just about everything. And then, of course, this year and last year presented some real challenges, certainly primarily among them COVID-19 and a global pandemic, which certainly changed how people interact in public. But there were also some other interesting challenges involved with this election. So what we thought we would do in today's webinar, bring on a couple of the real experts behind the efforts here at Edison Research on providing the exit polling and looking at some of the results, and get a sense of what some of the challenges were, how we dealt with those challenges, and then what we learned from that, from those experiences as a result. And of course, to take some of your questions as well. If you do have questions, we do have a couple of quick presentations to go through. But if you do have questions, please put them in the Q&A box, not in the chat box. If they're in the chat box, I will ignore them. But if they're in the Q&A box, we will get to as many as we can that we can get to. So please feel free to do that. So before we get started here, again, I want to thank you all for being here. And we're going to lead things off with Edison's Executive VP, Joe Lenski, who has really been the director of these efforts and maybe the leading trove of this archaic wisdom that we call exit polling. Joe, one of the questions that I often get from people when they ask about the elections is, well, how are you going to do exit polling this year? How are you going to do this? How are you going to be able to do this with the pandemic, with quarantine? Have you taken this into account? So before we sort of dive into that, why don't you tell us a little bit about the challenges that exit polling and vote count really brought to bear for us in 2020?
Thanks, Tom. And we've been thinking about those questions for years, and we had to think about those questions on the fly in 2020 as we were confronted with all sorts of challenges in this environment. 2020 was going to be a challenging year anyway, in terms of all the primaries and caucuses we had to cover and all the general elections. But in the middle of that process, we were hit with a pandemic, and how that changed not just how we collected data, but how people actually voted and the different methods they used in voting. So let me just go through some of the challenges we had to face in this environment. As I said, dealing with COVID-19 starting in March affected not just how we conducted the surveys, but how we worked. And as everyone on this call knows, we're all working in a different environment. So we had to deal with working virtually, our staff working virtually, but we had to train interviewers to go out and interview voters in person. And that environment was changed by the pandemic. And I'll go through some of how we experimented and tested methods to deal with that. The other ongoing challenge with these elections this year started even before the pandemic, waiting for results. Those of you that watched results either via television or via Twitter or the internet on election nights and primary and caucus nights in 2020 know that it was a different experience waiting for results to be reported on election night. And that started with the Iowa Democrat caucuses on February 3rd, pre-COVID, where the results literally took days for the Democratic Party report. And on caucus night, the only results that the members of the NEP could report on election night were the results from our entrance polls that we conducted that evening at caucuses across Iowa. The other challenge throughout the primaries was just the changing schedule. There were more elections rescheduled in 2020 than I've seen in all the 32 years that I've been covering elections since 1988. Elections were postponed at the last minute. Rules of how people were allowed to vote were changed at the last minute, and that was throughout the primaries. Primaries lasted a lot longer. Primaries that were supposed to be in March, April, and May ended up being in June, July, and August, and we had to change our schedule accordingly. And that led to changing election rules. Election officials on the fly had to come up with rules to allow people to vote safely, whether it was changing procedures for in-person voting or, in most states, increasing the availability of alternate methods of voting, mostly by-mail voting or in-person early voting. And all those changes affected the voting process, and it affected how we collected the information we collect via exit polls and other surveys that we did and reported on election night. In terms of the voting process, the biggest change was a massive increase in turnout. In the general election in November of 2020, a total of more than 158 million people cast ballots for president. That was an increase of more than 20 million over the number of votes cast in 2016 for president, and it was the highest percentage of voting eligible voters who participated in the presidential election since the presidential election of 1900. This was an increase that was predicted mainly because of the massive increase we saw in voter turnout in 2018. A lot of that was driven by both enthusiasm for and antipathy against the incumbent president, Donald Trump. But even in the COVID environment where there was some fear that that would limit the increase in turnout, it turned out it didn't. And a lot of the methods, including increased by-mail voting, led to this near record turnout. In terms of how people actually voted, we saw a dramatic increase in the number of people who cast their ballots before Election Day. More than 2/3 of voters in the presidential election actually cast their ballot before November 3rd. 43% casting a ballot by mail, another 25% nationally casting a ballot in person at an early voting center before Election Day. And that was more than the 42% who voted before Election Day in 2016. So the main driver of this increased turnout was increased by mail and increased early voting. But there was still the additional 33% who voted on Election Day. And our challenge in conducting the exit poll was to come up with a method that we could interview all these voters regardless of their voting method. How to best interview voters on Election Day, voters who are voting in person but at early voting centers, and voters who are voting by mail. And that was the challenge that we had facing us in terms of figuring out how to best survey voters on Election Day. So this process started for, the other part I want to mention too is we saw increased for the first time huge partisan differences between how people voted by voting method. You'll see in our surveys, and I'll show later on in this presentation, voting results showing that people who chose to vote by mail were much more likely to vote Democratic or for Joe Biden for president. Voters who chose to vote on Election Day were much more likely to vote Republican or for Donald Trump on Election Day. And that too had implications on how we collected the vote and also how we weighted our surveys to represent all those groups accurately.
So one of the things that certainly I get asked a lot by friends and family is a lot of it had to do around early voting, frankly. And they would ask me, you know, we all voted already. How are you getting our opinions? And how is that even going to work? And I struggle between two different replies. One is, I never thought of that before. Gosh, I guess we better go back to the drawing board. Just not true. Truth is, we think about these things all the time. And as a result, we have continued, not just this year, but we've tweaked our methods in previous elections for things like early voting and vote by mail. Certainly the pandemic threw another spanner into the works in terms of keeping everybody safe. So how did we in fact deal with all of this, Joe? What were some of the methods that we put into place, not just again from this year, but that we've actually been incorporating from previous elections?
Yeah, let me first talk about the process in the primaries before the COVID pandemic hit. And we ended up conducting surveys in 23 Democratic presidential primaries and caucuses. We interviewed over 37,000 Democratic primary and caucus voters in that process. And each of these states had a different procedure. The first one, as I said, was February 3rd in Iowa. That is an in-person caucus. And there we did entrance polling of caucus goers as they entered the caucus locations, and that was an entrance poll that we did. New Hampshire was the first primary on February 11th, and that was interviewing of voters on election day, where the vast majority of voters voted. The next event was the Nevada caucus, and Nevada introduced early voting for their caucus. So we were doing both in-person early voting interviews at their early voting centers the week leading up to the caucus day, and in-person entrance polling of the caucus site on February 22nd. And similarly, through the primaries, through South Carolina, through all the primaries on March 3rd, Super Tuesday, depending on how the state was voting, we had a combination of telephone surveys for early voting and by mail voters, in-person interviews at early voting centers in the days leading up to the primary, and election day in-person interviewing that we conducted on election day for election day voters. When the pandemic hit right after the March 10th primaries, we made the decision for the March 17th primaries to suspend all in-person interviewing. So those last three primaries on March 17th in Arizona, Florida, and Illinois, we did completely as telephone surveys of voters. And then at that point, we suspended surveying for the primaries. At that point, Joe Biden had pretty much clinched the nomination over Bernie Sanders. And then we went to the drawing board and says, okay, in this environment, how are we going to conduct in-person interviewing going forward? Because we had made the decision that in-person interviewing on election day and in-person interviewing at early voting centers was the best way to make sure the people we were interviewing were actual voters, and to make sure we got their responses right after they voted. And we didn't want to lose that ability, but we knew in the COVID environment, we had to change procedures to make voters feel comfortable in participating in our surveys, but also to protect the health and safety of our interviewers when they were conducting these surveys. So we did a lot of testing in primaries in 4 states, Georgia, Kentucky, New Jersey, and Delaware, that held primaries in June and July. And we developed procedures that we ended up using in November for all in-person interviewing. And many of these procedures are the same procedures that we are dealing with every day when we're going to the bank or the grocery store or wherever, or schools or wherever else we're going. And it's also the type of procedures that voting officials were using on election day to promote the safety of their poll workers and of voters who are voting in person. So I'll just go through several of the procedures we implemented. We tested in June and July and implemented in November. First, all our exit poll interviewers were required to wear a mask and gloves at all times while they were interviewing. In addition, we put space between our interviewers and the voters who they were interviewing. All our in-person interviews are self-administered, so the process had normally been handing a questionnaire to a voter as they were leaving a polling location or a early voting center. We kept the social distance, kept our interviewers 6 feet apart, and put the materials for the survey on a folding table outside the polling location, and the interviewer instructed the voter to go over, pick up a questionnaire, pick up a one-time use disposable golf pencil, and fill out the questionnaire that way, so we were able to maintain distance. We also provided on those tables gloves, hand sanitizer, sanitizing wipes, so voters would be able to use them. Interviewers were able to use them to sanitize the location after each voter had participated in the survey. Voters would fill out the questionnaires, fold up the questionnaire, put it in a box that we had there. So there was no close contact personal interaction between the survey taker and the interviewer. Interviewers were instructed to clean the location thoroughly after each voter. We, in addition, kept, as I said, a 6-foot distance between our interviewers and our voters that we interviewed. As I said, we produced one-use golf pencils instead of reusable pens. Every individual survey taker used a golf pencil, filled out the questionnaire. In fact, we purchased over 200,000 golf pencils to send to all our locations around the country. And then we had a disposal for any of those pencils, any sanitizing wipes, any gloves that were used. So basically the same types of safety precautions you're seeing in any interpersonal interactions in the COVID environment. This is some pictures of how it looked. It's several polling locations, how it was set up. The materials were placed out, and voters were encouraged to see that the procedures were safe, that they had hand sanitizer, other safety precautions, and they could participate in the survey. What we found is that, well, let me just go through the 3 types of methods we used. As I said, we did in-person exit poll interviewing at over 700 polling locations throughout the country on November 3rd, on election day. And this represented about 1/3 of all voters nationwide. 2, we did in-person exit poll interviewing of early voters at more than 175 early voting centers around the country. These are the places that states set up for voters to go the week or 2 or 3 weeks before election day to vote in person, but before election day. And that represented about 1/4 of all voters nationwide. And then the voters we couldn't interview in person through those methods, we interviewed by telephone. So we did telephone interviews across the country of absentee or by mail voters. And as I said, this year, in 2020 for the presidential election, that represented about 43% of all voters. Using these methods in the in-person exit polling response, we were able to maintain a 42% response rate in the 2020 general election using these methods. And that was only a tick below what we had in the 2020 primaries before COVID at 43%, and actually a point above what we saw in the midterm elections in 2018. As you can see, there's been slight decreases in response rates over the years, but we've been able, through our procedures, through adjustments to the questionnaire, through interviewer training, through the safety precautions we maintain this year, to be able to maintain more than 40% response rate for all our in-person interviewing. I think compared to other types of method, whether it's telephone surveys or online surveys, which are now in single-digit response rates, that's another key reason why we want to maintain the in-person interviewing on election day. It does mean that in-person interviewing, like any other survey, has survey error. It also has non-response error. It means more than half the people we approach still don't decide to participate in our surveys, and we account for that through weighting. We observe the people who refuse to take the survey, and we record the age, race, and gender of those folks, and adjust our results according to that non-response. We've also started over the last 2 cycles adjusting our results to account for an education and age bias that we've seen in terms of response rates compared to other surveys like the census survey of voters, and we've been using those adjustments to account for the non-response. But in this election, we had 3 distinct groups of voters based on 3 distinct voting methods. As I say, those that voted by mail, those that voted early in person, and those that voted on election day. And we found in our surveys, and I'll show in actual election results, there were real differences, real partisan differences between how those groups voted. As I said earlier, those that voted by mail, according to our surveys, voted almost 2-to-1 for Joe Biden. Biden had built up a 31-point edge among those early voters even before election day approached. The early in-person voters were more split, and according to our surveys, it was a 50-50 split between Biden and Trump among those who chose to vote in person but before Election Day. And the other big difference was the third of voters who voted on Election Day were much more likely to support Donald Trump. And we found a 20-point margin for Trump among our Election Day voters in our Election Day surveys. This is matched, if you look at individual states that have released their results by voting method, you can see that matches what these states were showing. And it also shows the key reasons why surveying by any method, not only in-person exit polling, but telephone surveys, online surveys, for any election this year was very tricky, because you were not only trying to estimate a total voter electorate, a likely voters or those who were going to vote, you had to also measure who was going to vote by which method and how those groups are voting and what the size of each method was going to be. Here's some examples from November 3rd, the presidential vote in Georgia and North Carolina. You can see the patterns in the results that those states reported, and they match what we saw in the exit poll. By mail voters voted about 2-to-1 for Biden in both those states. Early voters in person were a lot closer in both Georgia and North Carolina. There was a slight margin to Trump among early in-person voters. And then you see the big numbers for Trump versus Biden in the Election Day in-person voting. But if your survey leading up to Election Day is off in terms of the size, if you're overestimating or underestimating the Election Day vote or the by-mail vote, even if you get those groups correct in terms of their breakout by vote, if you're off by the size of that vote, it could have real critical effect on your overall estimate. And you can see these were both very close states. Joe Biden won in Georgia by less than, as we know now, based on Donald Trump's phone calls to the Georgia Secretary of State, Biden won by less than 12,000 votes, or 0.2%. In North Carolina, it was slightly the other way. Donald Trump won by a little more than 1%. But you can see if any of these, if you were estimating any of these numbers by any small amount, you could miss the overall margins quite substantially. And that was true not only on November 3rd, but on this slide, if you look in the election we just covered on January 5th, the two Georgia Senate runoff elections, you saw a similar pattern here. And these were close elections. We saw the same patterns. Democrats winning the by-mail vote 2-to-1, very close numbers in terms of the early in-person voting, and then Election Day in-person voting going substantially Republican. The partisan differences on January 5th were even more than the partisan differences in Georgia on November 3rd. Democrats were even more likely to vote before Election Day. Republicans were even more likely to vote on Election Day. And we'll see if those patterns continue in a post-Trump era, but at least in the first post-Trump election that we covered in Georgia on January 5th, those distinctions by voting method not only maintained themselves, they actually increased over November 3rd.
So I want to get to Randy Brown here in just a moment to talk about some of the findings that we took from these data. I do want to address a couple of questions came in on the Q&A box, really about methods. And well, here's the first one, Joe, and just kind of to frame it, I think if you looked at the percentage of people in the last election who voted prior to Election Day, it was about 2/3, right?
Yeah.
That seems high. I bet that would seem high to a lot of people who have not been students of the elections as we have. Paul asked a question, how does that compare to 2016 and 2012? And I guess on top of that, how quickly has that happened as a phenomenon? How fast have we gone down that cliff, I guess, in terms of early voting?
Early voting has increased substantially. I mean, when I first started covering elections in 1988, it was nationally under 10% voted before Election Day, and throughout the 90s, it slowly increased. By the year 2000, it was about 15 to 20%, and then it kept increasing after that. As I said, in 2012, it was 42%. So this has been a long-term trend, and certain states like Oregon, Colorado, Washington have promoted all by mail voting. Bigger states like Florida and Texas and California have been promoting it, even though they're not all by mail, they're vast majority by mail or early voting now. So this has been a trend that has been gradually increasing for more than 20 years, but COVID and the changes in how people chose to vote and how election officials promoted by mail voting showed a dramatic increase, as I said, more than 20% increase in early voting between 2016 and 2020. But this was a pattern that had been developing for decades.
We also got a question from David about response rate. Now, we showed a graph a few moments ago about the historical response rates for exit polling, which are typically in the low to mid 40s. And you mentioned that they're certainly better than what you might see on telephone surveys. How do they compare to the early telephone surveys that we did for things like for early voters and absentee ballots?
Yeah, I mean, our telephone surveys of by mail voters and early voters have the same low response rates that most telephone surveys did. They're typically in the 5 to 8% response range. So that's why we have promoted the continuation of in-person interviewing to maintain the higher response rates. Now, back when exit polling was developed in the 60s and when I was first doing it in 1988, telephone surveys still had 40 or 50% response rates throughout the 80s and the early 90s. It's just been a gradual decrease, both because of the increased use of cell phones and also because of the increased use of people in terms of phone number blocking as well, and people just not using the phone as much as they used to for communication, and people much less likely to answer phone calls. So that's been a long-term trend the other way. But we've been able to maintain the response rates over 40%, at least in our in-person interviewing.
Yeah, certainly my friends watching this who are in the marketing business might look at those 40+% response rates and think there's a typo in there, especially if you're used to direct mail, direct marketing, where the response rates can even have a decimal point in front of them. So we learned a lot from the election, and I think we learned a couple of things. Certainly, if you owned a mini golf establishment, you learned that there weren't any more pencils to be had, because we cleaned out the country in mini golf pencils, and you were cursing Edison. But we also learned a lot from the actual results of the vote and how people did in fact cast their ballots. So I want to bring on Edison Research's Vice President Randy Brown, who's really one of our leading experts on polling and election research and stats. And Randy, tell us a little bit about what we learned. And again, if you do have questions, put them in the Q&A box. I will be able to get to some after Randy goes through this. But Randy, what did we learn?
Thanks a lot, Tom. I'm going to focus on two main components of the election, demographics and then some issues that we found. So the first is we'll look at some demographics, and we're going to look at first the gender gap that occurred in the November 2020 election. So as you can see, men voted 8% more for Donald Trump, while women voted 15% more for Joe Biden, a gender gap of 23 points. The gender gap is virtually unchanged from 2016, where there was a 22-point gender gap. We also saw differences on how someone voted by how old they were. So among the youngest voters, they voted for Joe Biden by 24%, which is an increase of 5% from the 2016 election. Voters 30 to 64 were about split between the two candidates, and the oldest voters were the group that Donald Trump did best amongst. Now, if we look at the vote by different ethnic groups, we'll see some stark differences. White voters supported Donald Trump by 17 points, which is slightly less than 2016. Donald Trump beat Hillary Clinton by 20 points among white voters there. Non-white voters heavily supported Joe Biden, though. Donald Trump did do slightly better with Hispanic and Black voters, but Joe Biden ran up such overwhelming margins, and that is one of the main reasons why he won in November. There were also differences based on educational attainment. Voters who had received a bachelor's degree supported Joe Biden by 12 points, while voters without a bachelor's degree narrowly supported Donald Trump. While there are some differences based on the total education, where we saw the real split was among white voters. So as you'll see, white voters with a bachelor's degree went slightly for Joe Biden, while those without a bachelor's degree split heavily for Donald Trump. And among voters of color, the vote difference was basically the same whether you had a bachelor's degree or you did not. So now we've looked at some of the main demographics. We're going to look at some of the issues and how they shaped the race. So since Biden became the presumptive nominee in March and April, the race between him and Donald Trump in my opinion, turned on three issues: the economy, the coronavirus pandemic, and temperament. So we first asked people who'd better handle the economy, and voters were evenly divided between Biden and Trump. They both got 49%. We then asked them who would better handle the coronavirus pandemic. And there, voters chose Biden 53 to 43%. So with voters having such different views of how the major candidates would handle the two main issues, we also asked what was more important: containing the coronavirus, even if it hurt the economy, or rebuilding the economy, even if it hurt efforts to contain the coronavirus. And voters said that containing the coronavirus was more important. If the Trump campaign was able to persuade voters that the economy was more important than containing the coronavirus, it's possible that the results in November would have turned out differently. So the last issue I'll talk about is temperament. We asked if Donald Trump and Joe Biden had the temperament to serve effectively as president. And 54% of voters said Joe Biden did, while only 44% said that Donald Trump did. So the slide before, we showed that on Donald Trump's job performance, 50% of people said they thought Donald Trump was doing a good job as president. They approved of it, but they didn't vote for him because they didn't think his personality was a fit to be president. So now that I've spent a few minutes on the November elections, we'll just do a couple slides on the last election we covered in Georgia. And looking at how voters voted in 2020 and then how they voted in the Senate runoffs, we'll see that the voters who voted for Biden stuck largely with the Democratic candidate, and the voters who voted for Trump stayed largely with the Republican candidate. Voters who voted for a third party, which was 3% of the vote, split about evenly. But the group I want to focus on, and it's important to note, it is only 2%, but in a race that was decided by only 1%, those people matter. So the people who didn't vote in November split heavily, 2-1, for the Democratic candidates. And we saw that both in the Ossoff-Perdue race and on the Warnock-Loeffler race. The last point I just want to make about Georgia, and probably how elections might go from now on, is just how nationalized this race was. We asked people, or asked voters, if they would rather see the Senate be controlled by the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, and they were about evenly split, a 1-point edge for the Democratic Party, which almost perfectly matched the election results, with both Democratic candidates winning by small margins. So the Georgia race was nationalized, and we'll see if all future elections will be just as nationalized as Georgia was.
Super. So we've got some time for questions. Already got a few in the Q&A box, which we're going to address. And again, please put them in the Q&A box and not in the chat box. Brad Hill asks if these slides will be available. The answer is yes. Not immediately, but fairly soon. We're going to write an article around these. We have a question from Faisal, who is writing us from Libya. Welcome. That's a long way away. And this question is basically a number of respondents. What's the sample size? And the one thing I think a lot of people don't know about the exit polls is it's the largest single-day survey that I know of. So in the various methods that we used, and Joe, I'll throw this one over to you. What kinds of sample sizes are we dealing with?
Yeah, I mean, you'll see different sample sizes based on the different surveys reported. The national sample, which is interviews in all 50 states, election day interviews and telephone interviews of early voters. In that survey, we had over 15,000 voters, but we also did breakouts in 25 states. And if you add up all the interviews we did, both for the state surveys and the national surveys, we contacted well over 100,000 people if you include both the election day voters we talked to, the early voters we talked to, and the absentee and by mail voters we talked to by telephone.
So here's a question, and I'm going to sort of combine a couple of these questions here. We certainly saw some splits in the electorate that really both of you have alluded to in terms of what percentage voted for whom early and what percentage voted for whom on election day. Any other sort of cohorts like that stand out? And do you have an opinion on why we saw such a lean for the Democrat in early voting as opposed to on election day itself?
Yeah, well, I'll take that part of it. I mean, it was clear from both President Trump's rhetoric that he was encouraging his voters to vote in person and was trying to cast doubt on the accuracy or even legality of by-mail voting in a lot of states, while the Democratic side and Joe Biden ran a campaign that encouraged by-mail voting, or at least encouraged people to be more cognizant of the safety issues with the COVID pandemic than the Republicans did. So I think it was encouragement from both candidates and both parties in terms of how they encouraged their voters to participate. But I think it has metastasized through the news media in terms of almost a badge of partisanship that Republicans wanted to say, we're coming out to vote on election day, and we're not going to have the COVID pandemic change that, while Democrats were much more likely to say, for safety reasons, we're going to promote by-mail voting and avoid in-person voting. So I think it had both the factors of how the candidates and the parties were promoting their own voting, but it also became part of this issue that Randy talked about in terms of the different factors of by party and by candidate on which they thought was most important. Safety precautions for the COVID pandemic, or keeping the economy and keeping things open regardless of the COVID pandemic.
Just real quick, I want to address one question about the differences between how a vote looks in an exit poll and how a vote looks in the actual election. And I think a lot of people don't necessarily take into concept that the exit poll is a survey, right, and has a margin of error. Do you want to address that really quickly?
Yeah, I mean, an exit poll is a survey like any other survey. So there's margin of error due to sample size and sampling. In-person sampling is a two-step process because we have to randomly select the locations where we send our interviewers to. And then even within those locations, we're randomly selecting voters as they leave the polling location to interview them. But as I said earlier, there's also non-response issues when it comes to error. And we do know that younger voters are more likely to fill out a questionnaire than older voters. College-educated voters are more likely to fill out a survey than non-college educated voters. We adjust that based on what our interviewers observe in terms of the age, race, and gender of the voters who decline to participate in our survey. And we also make adjustments based on the historical patterns of non-response by age and by college education. So a survey, an exit poll is a survey, as I said, like any other survey. We have sampling error, we have non-response error. We also make adjustments as we get the vote returns from each precinct, where we have an exit poll interviewer to adjust the results to make sure they match the results by precinct. And overall, the final survey results that everyone uses are weighted to adjust for the number of votes by geographic region in every state.
I think this is probably a good place to wrap a couple things together in the same question. And I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about what exit polls do and don't do. One of which is their role in, quote unquote, calling an election. Do you want to say a word about exactly what role exit polling does, if at all, play in that? And just talk about the differences between reporting a vote and certifying a vote and all of those issues. Yeah,
I mean, when you see a race that's usually a landslide election called at poll closing, that call will be based on an exit poll. But very few of the key elections are called solely on exit polls. Most elections are much closer than the margin of error in an exit poll, and we will wait until we get sample precinct results, and in many cases, we'll wait till we get county results in enough volume to be able to project a result. As I said earlier, this race was even trickier than normal because you not only had to know where these votes were coming from, you had to know what method of vote was being counted in those results. And we saw in certain states like Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, where the election day vote was reported first in most locations, and then the by-mail vote was reported later in the evening, sometimes in the middle of the night or even later. And as you saw those partisan differences by voting method, you can see in states where the election day vote was reported earlier, Donald Trump usually built a lead, and then as the by-mail vote was counted, that lead decreased, and in several of those states, Joe Biden overcame the margin based on the early vote and the by-mail vote. But there were other states like Florida and North Carolina and Texas that were able to process their by-mail voting by the rules in their state earlier than Election Day, and they were able to report the by-mail vote right after the polls closed. So you would see those states, Joe Biden jumping to a lead, and then as the Election Day vote came in, Donald Trump caught up, and in some of those states passed Biden based on his margins among the Election Day vote. What we were reporting on election night and throughout the process are unofficial tallies. We have reporters at thousands of locations calling in results that they're being told by election officials. We have different feeds between states and counties and our computer systems to take in results. We're also scraping various websites as results are reported both at the county and state level. But everything you see on election night and the days thereafter is unofficial votes. And as I think most people learned through the process in Georgia on November 3rd, the unofficial results don't determine the outcome. It's only once they're certified at the county level and then at the state level that that's the official returns. And you will find that counties and precincts in that certification process may find errors in the unofficial results as they were posted. There's often errors in the communication of results, either to our reporters live on the scene at county vote locations or in the computer transmissions, and those are corrected in the certification process. And as we saw in Georgia, if the certification process is questioned and the margins are small enough, there can be recounts and several recounts, and that happened in Georgia, is still ongoing in the New York 22nd Congressional District, where we still don't know the winner from November 3rd in that House race. So the votes you see from us on election night are unofficial, and they end up being certified. Usually along the way, small errors are discovered and they're corrected either on election night or shortly thereafter or in the certification process. But that's a procedure that's happened all along, and it's to get to a final certified result that matches what the actual vote returns are.
Yeah, and a lot of people ask us about obtaining data and raw data and things like that. That data is always archived to the Roper Center sometime after the election. So that's when it is made available for the general public to be able to access and look at it as they see fit.
Yeah, all our exit poll surveys, all our election surveys are archived at the Roper Center. That goes back to the first ones we did for the National Election Pool in 2003, and the exit polls before that done by CBS and NBC and ABC and Voter News Service back to the early 70s are all archived at the Roper Center.
So I want to put together a couple of questions here that Lauren asked, and Randy, I'll throw these to you, and Joe, as you want to kind of add your thoughts here as well. How did your sample in the 2020 election compare between Democrats and Republicans? It seems Democrats are often oversampled. Or, to put it another way, are the response rates different between party affiliation, which I think is really the salient question. What do we see?
We have seen historically that Democrats are a little bit more likely to take the exit poll than Republicans. We correct for that with our weighting and how we account for it. And in this election, we had the electorate pretty much split. 37% of people identified themselves as a Democrat, and 36% of people identified themselves as a Republican, with another 26% as independent or something else.
So yeah, here's a question from Austria. We really have an international audience today, which is fantastic. Rudiger, hi Rudiger, asks, hi from Austria. In my country, people tend not to tell the truth in exit polls. We often see a strong bias towards social democrats and Greens. Calibration has to be done after each election, essentially. Do you have the same issues in the US? And there's really, I guess, a couple issues here. One is, how do we weight our polling data? Because it certainly does get weighted. And then there's, of course, this do people lie in exit polls issue, and I think we probably have a take on that as well. So I'll throw this open to either of you.
Well, I'll talk about that because I hear that a lot in terms of how do we know people are telling the truth. There's a very little evidence that people that take the time to respond to surveys, whether it's in person on election day or by telephone, or are actually lying to pollsters. I think the bigger concern, as I said earlier, is the non-response. I think we do have indications that certain groups are more likely to decline to participate in our surveys, and that's where we need to make the adjustments we've talked about. I mean, we have observable evidence in terms of that differential response rate by age. We have lots of survey evidence of differential response rate by education level as well, and those have some correlation to party non-response. So if you're, as the data Randy showed, if you have more young people or more college-educated voters participating in your survey, you are going to have, by definition, a Democratic bias, because those groups are much more likely to be Democratic, the groups participating in your survey, and the groups that are declining to participate in your survey are much more likely to be Republican. So we have procedures to adjust for that non-response. I think the more critical issue to the polling industry as a whole, both in what we do in terms of election polling, and also more importantly, what is done in pre-election polling, is within those groups, are we doing enough to adjust for non-response? I just watched a panel last week with Doug Rivers from YouGov, where he has a panel that he observes throughout the election cycle, and he found that among Republicans who approved of Donald Trump, their response rates in his surveys went down throughout 2020. But those Republicans who disapproved of Donald Trump, it's a small group, their response rates actually went up. So just adjusting for response rate by education or by age or by party wouldn't catch that differential response within different types of Republicans. And I think those of us like Doug that has that data in terms of the panel he has at YouGov, and those of us that have other information have to look at it closely to say, can we do a better job of not only adjusting for the response rates we observe by demographic groups, but are there attitudinal differences within those demographic groups that we have to do a better job of adjusting for non-response?
Here's a question that Kevin asked earlier. I want to kind of go back to. What regional trends stood out to you? Of course, all politics is local, and the way that some districts are drawn up almost defies the concept of regional trends, I suppose. But anything stand out from a regional basis?
I mean, in terms of the regions, the East, the Northeast and the West broke heavily for Joe Biden. And the Midwest and South went for Donald Trump, but not at the same rate as the West. You know, that's really where Joe Biden ran up his 7 million vote count lead, was in the Californians and the New Yorks of the world.
Yeah, and I think more important than regional in this election was the difference between urban, suburban, and rural. We've been seeing this divergence for decades. It just seemed to accelerate more in the two Donald Trump presidential elections, but we saw Democrats winning in almost every major metropolitan area and increasing Biden's increase over Hillary Clinton was most in suburban areas, but rural areas went for Donald Trump even more in 2020 than they did in a lot of locations in 2016. So this divergence between metropolitan areas and rural small town America has been growing over the last few decades and grew even more in the 2020 election compared to 2016.
So we've got one more question in the box here from Charlie, who says most of the numbers in your exit poll seem to make a lot of sense. Thank you, Charlie. One that sticks out: white women with college degrees, which Trump won by a point, almost a toss-up, really. Any additional perspective that you want to lend on that one?
Yeah, that's again a tricky demographic to measure. Because you have a lot of cross currents there. You know, as Randy showed, the gender gap was at historically high levels in terms of overall women voting more Democratic and men voting more Republican. And we also saw that college educated gap growing at the biggest level. But at the same time, there are plenty of groups that supported Donald Trump at very large levels. Evangelical and Born Again Christians supported Donald Trump by more than a 50-point margin. So there's a lot of different groups, subgroups within white college-educated voters, white college-educated women. There's also differences between married white college-educated women and non-married white college-educated women. So I think what our survey shows is you can't stereotype that single group that way. And there's a lot of different subgroups with a lot of different cross pressures in terms of how they vote to take into account.
Yeah, and I think politics really highlights something, Joe, that I like to call the Bon Jovi problem. When someone says, "I don't understand how how Bon Jovi sold 80 million records," I think the correct response is that means you don't understand 80 million people. And people do in fact vote in different ways and can be inscrutable to one side or the other, but do in fact do that. And it's our job essentially to report as reputably and as credibly as we can what the present actually shows. Nino asks a question: could you discuss how the NEP, the National Election Pool member networks, use Edison Research exit poll data, and any changes over the years that are noteworthy?
Well, I'll let the members themselves talk about how they use it. They all have very well-trained polling professionals. They all conduct their own surveys. They pool their resources with us for the exit poll, but they all have very high-level analysts, both for exit poll analysis and also on all their decision teams. Each of the NEP members have their own editorial decision desks that make the decisions on when they call races and when they don't. In addition, this year we had additional subscribers to our exit poll. Reuters joined as a distributing partner, and Reuters reported our exit polling data and also distributed to international subscribers like the BBC. And we also had the New York Times and the Washington Post as subscribers to our exit poll and vote data this year. And all of them used it within their editorial expertise.
So Randy, here's a question for you from Peter. What can the exit polls tell us about late deciders? Who were they? What issues were important to them? And when did they decide? When did they decide, and how did they vote? I think you've got some perspective on that.
Yeah, I'll tell you, the most interesting thing to me about time of decision in this year is how few people chose by the end of the campaign. In 2016, 25%, a quarter of the electorate said they made their decision on whom to vote for in the last month. In 2020, it was 13%. So before the first debate between Joe Biden and Donald Trump, 87% of voters said that they had already decided who to vote for. This was an election that people had decided, months before the actual election date, who they were going to vote for. The late deciders broke very slightly, a few points for Donald Trump, but it just wasn't enough to overcome the advantage of the 87% who had decided to vote, or before that, and that group broke heavily for Biden.
A quick follow-up on archiving this data, Joe. When does it actually get archived at the Roper Center, and who's the keepers of the keys on that? In terms of archiving it, we are expecting to archive it in the Roper this summer at the Roper Center. So it should be, sometime between May and August, hopefully closer to May.
And there'll be two big sets, as I said earlier. There'll be the 23 states where we did exit polling or entrance polling for the primaries and caucuses. There'll be all 50 states and DC from the November general election. And then there'll also be the additional Georgia Senate runoff election from January 5th, where we did both in-person exit poll interviewing on election day, in-person early voting interviewing, and telephone interviewing of by-mail voters.
Super. Well, gentlemen, I don't see any more questions, and we are just about out of time. So I want to thank everyone for the gift of their time and attention. Randy and Joe, for your steady hand at the tiller and your expertise. And thank you very much for attending this webinar. We'll have the slides and an article up about it fairly shortly. And enjoy the rest of your day, everyone. Thanks for being here.